Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we'll be looking at my picks for the top 12 quotes in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As always, I've chosen quotes that cover the main themes and characters, and are as easy to memorize as possible, because there's no point in knowing loads of analysis about a quote if you can't even remember it in your exam. So let's get right into the first one. I incline to Cain's heresy. The first quote honours go to Mr. Utterson in Chapter 1, where we are introduced to his character. He is immediately set up as the model of a perfect Victorian gentleman, restrained, respectable, and well-liked in society. But the thing that makes him different is his tolerance for others. He does not let other people's misfortunes affect his opinion of them. But what exactly does it mean when he says, I incline to Cain's heresy? This is actually a biblical reference to the story of Cain and Abel, two brothers who are kind of the original manifestations of duality, in that Abel was the good brother and Cain the bad brother. Because God looked on Abel's sacrifice with greater favour, Cain murders him, and when God asks him where his brother is, he responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" What he is saying is that he is not responsible for looking after him, and so this is also what Utterson means with the Cain reference. He doesn't feel like he needs to get involved in the private affairs of others, and seems fairly non-judgmental, especially for that time when people were so concerned with reputation and not being involved in scandals. Through this quote, Stevenson is showing us why he has chosen this seemingly plain character as the perspective through which this mystery is told. Because he is more concerned with his friendships than the immoral acts which they get up to in secret, he is very well liked by people, and is a central figure in Jekyll's social circle, meaning that he has access to all the main characters in this story. His non-judgmental attitude also means that he's often the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men, and this is a bit of foreshadowing by the author, as he is said to be the last real friend in Jekyll's life when everything spirals out of control. The street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood. This quote is a description from Chapter 1 of the part of London where Mr. Enfield and Mr. Utterson are going for their weekly walk. And it's an important one, because it showcases how the major theme of duality is represented even in the characters' surroundings. In this one little area, there is a street with a thriving trade and an air of invitation, while just down the road is a sinister block of building that had the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. This little pocket of London symbolises the duality of Victorian society as a whole, and the hypocrisy of their obsession with respectability. Stevenson is demonstrating that duality can be found everywhere we look, and that anywhere or anyone that looks perfect on the outside is usually covering up or repressing something darker and less appealing. Jekyll's house is another example of duality in this novella's setting, as it has a fashionable side to present to the world, but a secret laboratory in the back to conduct his ethically questionable experiments and hide his murderous alter ego. I saw that Sawbones turn sick and white with the desire to kill him. This is Mr. Enfield's quote from Chapter 1, which is taken from his account of Mr. Hyde trampling over a little girl. The Sawbones he is referring to is a doctor that was called to see to the little girl's injuries, and although we might usually think of doctors as non-violent, upstanding citizens, Enfield says that he is sick and white with a desire to kill him. The doctor doesn't just want to have Hyde arrested or maybe beat him up a bit, he actually wants to murder him, and he wants to so badly that he physically turns pale. What's more, Enfield says that he was like the rest of us. Everyone in the crowd wants to kill Hyde, but they stop themselves from doing it because it is not socially acceptable. So you can probably see by now that this quote links strongly to the themes of violence, hypocrisy, repression, and reputation. Stevenson shows right from the beginning that the desire for violence is not limited to Mr. Hyde, he is just the only one who acts on it. Everyone has the capability for violence, and it is only the strict Victorian rules of respectability and their desire to maintain their perfect reputations that makes them repress their anger and darker urges. While this is usually a good thing, the overly harsh rules of Victorian society meant that people's emotions were constantly being repressed and pent up inside them, leading to potentially explosive consequences, like in the case of Dr. Jekyll. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. This is also one of Enfield's lines in Chapter 1, and refers of course to Mr. Hyde. He is not the only one who has this reaction to him either. Everyone who meets him seems to feel immediately put off by him, but are unsure exactly why. This uncertainty is evoked by the repetition of something, while the alliteration of the sibilant sound s and the hard d sound in displeasing and downright detestable highlights his sly and evil nature and suggests that he is a dangerous character. Utterson has a similar feeling of disgust, loathing, and fear, and describes him as giving an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. The reason why he is so immediately unlikable is probably because Hyde is the only character who, ironically, is not hiding anything about himself. He wears his true colours on his face, and is not concerned about putting on the mask of civility and respectability like everyone else. By being unapologetically himself, albeit a horrible, nasty human being, he is challenging the social rules and exposing the hypocrisy of Victorian society, who were so concerned with outward appearances and would pretend to be model citizens, but secretly do bad things when nobody was looking. For instance, we could definitely question what Enfield himself was doing in a bad part of town at 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, in time to see Hyde trample the little girl. Hyde is holding up a mirror through which they can see their own sins, and it is no wonder this instantly makes them uncomfortable. He began to go wrong in the mind. Such unscientific balderdash. Dr. Lanyon gives this quote in Chapter 2 as the reason they stopped speaking for many years. As a fellow scientist, he thinks Jekyll's experiments cross moral and logical boundaries, not just remaining in the material world, but transcending it into the metaphysical or even the supernatural. What he says here highlights the key theme of science in this novella, as during the Industrial Revolution, advancements in technology and scientific discoveries took a huge leap forward. Because people were not used to this new way of life, they were understandably worried about just how far science could go, and Stevenson plays on their fears through Jekyll's monstrous creation. His experiments would also have gone against religious ideals of the time, as it would have been seen by Victorians as playing God by separating his character into two beings. Christians believe that God is the only one who should have the power to create life, so what he is doing would have been seen as pretty blasphemous. Although science and religion often come into conflict during this novella, this is the one thing they agree about, as Lanyon repeats the word wrong to highlight how morally unethical his actions are, and calls them unscientific balderdash. Interestingly though, the ingredients of his transformation potion sound decidedly scientific, with words like salt, powders, phosphorus, and ether. However, when he first puts it all together, the ritual sounds more like witchcraft, saying, "Late one accursed night I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion." Jekyll seems to use a mix of science and the occult, or alchemy, to create his alter ego, a method which would have been shunned by both Christians and scientists alike. The moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. This statement from Jekyll to Mr. Utterson reveals his belief that he can control the Hyde part of his personality. This story is really a tragedy by definition, with Jekyll as the tragic figure, brought down by his fatal flaw, which is overconfidence or hubris. He thinks that he is in control of the situation and can be rid of Mr. Hyde whenever he pleases, but he severely underestimates the power of the evil he has unleashed and does not admit it until it is too late. This illusion of control leads Jekyll to allow Hyde to do whatever he pleases for a long time and not worry about the consequences. However, when he actually tries to exercise his power and repress his dark side, as he used to for many years, it has the opposite effect. When Hyde returns, he is worse than ever. As Jekyll says, "My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring." And this leads to the murder of Sir Danvers Carew. From this point on, Hyde takes over more and more of Jekyll's life, no longer needing the potion to transition, and becoming more unpredictable. It becomes evident that Jekyll actually had no control from the second he chose to create Hyde, but his hubris stops him from seeing it until the very end, and also stops him from accepting help from concerned friends like Utterson, who are able to see objectively that he is not the one in the position of power. With ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows. No surprises here, this quote from chapter 4 is about Mr. Hyde, and is a graphic description of how he murdered Sir Danvers, an older gentleman who is also a member of Parliament. There's lots to unpack in this quote, starting with ape-like fury. Hyde is often described in animalistic terms to suggest that the way he behaves is subhuman, without remorse or empathy. There's also a link here to Darwin's theory of evolution, and at the time some Victorians believed that if we could evolve from animals like apes, we could also revert back to that state, a concept called atavism or devolution. Stevenson plays on their fears with Hyde's incredibly violent nature, which sharply contrasts with the expectations of restraint, morality, and decorum in Victorian society. This is Hyde's most violent act in the novella, and it's important to note the word victim here, which refers to Sir Danvers. Hyde's violence is not directed towards anyone who deserves it, or even anyone who is his physical match. He seems to like hurting women, children, and older men, the categories of people who you'd think would not be a target. Hyde's choice of victim emphasizes his total lack of empathy and disregard for human life, as it is the vulnerable and innocent whom he directs his cruelty towards. Lastly, let's look at the phrase hailing down a storm of blows. The words hailing and storm are associated with the weather or forces of nature. He is also described as breaking out in a great flame of anger before the attack, which references the element of fire. These terms are used to describe Hyde's actions because Stevenson is suggesting that his behavior is natural, and something that we are all born with that is left over from our primal ancestors, but that we now repress and hide in order to meet the expectations of society. If your master is dead, we may at least save his credit. This quote from Mr. Utterson in chapter 8 highlights the theme of reputation and friendship in this novella. Throughout his investigation, Utterson is primarily concerned with protecting Dr. Jekyll's good name, as he is a respected member of the community, and just one whiff of a scandal could destroy that. He assumes that Hyde has control over Jekyll somehow, perhaps because he is blackmailing him for the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace. And this might have been fairly common back then, as people were forced to hide the shameful things they liked to do that were not considered socially acceptable or run the risk of ruin. It is incredible, however, that although he's in this extraordinary situation with Hyde dead on the floor in Jekyll-sized clothes, and Jekyll himself almost certainly dead, Utterson still manages to think about saving his credit. He is already trying to do damage control to preserve his reputation, and this raises some questions about the moral priorities of that time. It seems to be more important to the characters to protect his good name after death, rather than consider the ethical implications of his actions or the consequences of his experiments. This emphasizes the tendency of Victorians to put social standing over personal accountability, but it also tells us a lot about Jekyll and Utterson's friendship. Instead of running away from this potential scandal in case he is somehow linked to it, as many others would have, Utterson tries to help Jekyll and protect him as much as possible, even in inexplicable situations like these. I concealed my pleasures, and stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. This line is from Jekyll in chapter 10, where he reflects on his life in a posthumous letter to Mr. Utterson. In this quote, he acknowledges the internal conflict that has defined his life. As a member of a wealthy, respectable family, he has always had to meet societal expectations, which meant repressing every base and potentially shameful instinct he has. This secrecy leads to him essentially living a double life, which is so extreme that he calls it profound. We don't know exactly what Jekyll's concealed pleasures are, and if you watch my character analysis on Jekyll, you will get a more in-depth version. But what we do know is that he says many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, meaning that his secrets are probably not even that bad. But in the overly harsh and restrictive Victorian society, Jekyll feels like his reputation has to be totally perfect. In fact, this whole novel could be seen as a criticism by Stevenson of the impossibly harsh moral codes they were forced to live by, which may have had the opposite effect, creating Hydes within the upright Jekylls of society. Man is not truly one, but truly two. This is perhaps the most well-known quote in the novella, and for good reason, as it sums up Jekyll's whole worldview and the reasons why he created Hyde. The word truly is repeated as it highlights Jekyll's absolute belief in this statement. It's important to note that Jekyll says man instead of I, suggesting that everyone has two sides to them, not just him. We could see this from a religious context where everyone has a sinful and a virtuous side, dating back to Adam and Eve's original sin. Because they ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we as their descendants are all cursed by being born as sinners. The two sides can also be seen as civilized and uncivilized, as Jekyll presents himself as a model of civility and respectability, while Hyde's actions go directly against the social order. But whatever the context, Jekyll fails to reconcile the two sides of himself, leading to the creation of Hyde and his ultimate downfall. His story raises important debates about the extent to which we can, or should, suppress these parts of ourselves, and the consequences of failing to recognize and integrate these opposite sides into one cohesive self. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. In Chapter 10, Jekyll talks about his first transformation into Hyde, describing the immense freedom he felt in the skin of his alter ego. The phrase younger, lighter, happier uses a syndeton, a literary device where a group of words are listed without using a conjunction like and or but. This speeds up the pace of the text and emphasizes the excitement and liberation he feels in his new form. Younger, lighter, and happier are all good things, but when we combine it with not an innocent freedom of the soul, it becomes clear that this freedom comes with strings attached. His euphoria at becoming Hyde stems from the fact that he no longer has to abide by society's rules, which he has found restrictive and even oppressive his whole life. Although this seems to be the perfect solution at first, Jekyll soon discovers that Hyde is not content to be a part instead of a whole. His evil side soon takes control of his physical form, until it is Hyde who is in the driver's seat, and Jekyll who comes out only when called. We can see this shift in control when Utterson and Enfield see Jekyll in Chapter 7, looking like some disconsolate prisoner. He goes from being confined by society's rules to being confined in a prison of his own making, too afraid to go out in case Hyde, who is a wanted murderer, decides to take over. I knew myself to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked. In Chapter 10, Jekyll talks about his first transformation into Hyde, and importantly, admits that from the very start he knew that what he had done was morally wrong, and that he had created a totally wicked being. The repetition of more wicked emphasizes the capacity for evil that he has inside him that was being repressed this whole time, and that was probably much greater than he initially anticipated or admitted to himself. His transformation into Hyde allows this evil to be let out into the world, free from the restrictions of society and conscience that Jekyll is bound by. The word myself is very important here, as it shows that Jekyll is finally taking responsibility for the actions of Hyde, and acknowledging that they are just as much his actions. Although he dresses him in different clothes, buys him his own house, and refers to him in the third person, Hyde is Jekyll and Jekyll is Hyde. But it is Jekyll alone who is responsible for creating this creature, letting him loose on the streets and returning to that form again and again, despite knowing straight away how wicked he was, and after witnessing countless acts of wickedness committed by his own hands. By thinking of Hyde as a different person, he relieves his conscience, saying that it was Hyde after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty. This raises interesting questions about the nature of accountability. If none of us had to face consequences for our actions, would we also find ourselves to be tenfold more wicked? Probably. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for follow-up analysis videos soon to come. See you next time!